Welcome to this YSL video tutorial on SQL Server 2016. This fairly short video is going to explain how you can install SQL Server Data Tools, or SSDT for short. So the video is going to get you up and running with the SQL Server Data Tools, but first we're going to start with an explanation of what they actually are, so you know why we're going to do this in the first place. We'll talk about how you can optionally install Visual Studio 2015 Community Edition, which is a free edition of Visual Studio. It just requires a Microsoft account to sign up for. And then we'll talk about how you can install the actual SQL Server Data Tools component in Visual Studio. So you will need at least some type of installation of Visual Studio. We'll explain how you can install the full version optionally. We'll then look at how you can run Visual Studio for the first time, including how you can sign into your Microsoft account just to register the software and make sure your license has been activated, and then how you can create a basic business intelligence project using the new SQL Server Data Tools templates. We're not going to do anything important in that project, it's just to establish that the tools have been installed successfully. Just for the final part of the video, we're going to explain a little bit of the basics of working inside Visual Studio. So we'll explain how to manipulate and manage windows, how you can reset settings if you get things all messed up, and then finally how you can close and reopen projects that you've worked on previously. So let's get started. I guess I should start by quickly explaining what SQL Server Data Tools actually is. So really SQL Server Data Tools is just a collection of project templates that get installed into something called Microsoft Visual Studio. So Visual Studio is Microsoft's flagship development tool. You can create pretty much any application you can think of using this tool. Once you've installed SQL Server Data Tools, what you'll get when you choose to create a new project is a new little category of templates called Business Intelligence. And what these templates allow you to do are create projects such as SQL Server Analysis Services projects, or SQL Server Integration Services, or SQL Server Reporting Services projects. So the idea behind this video is to explain how to get these templates installed so that you can go about creating these types of projects for future video tutorials we're going to run. Okay, so the best place to start is with your favourite search engine in whichever web browser you want to use. It doesn't really matter which one you choose, but just have a quick search for SQL Server Data Tools. And when you've searched for that, you ought to end up with a link for Download SQL Server Data Tools, or SSDT for short, which is part of the Microsoft Developer Network site. So if you click that link, it'll take you away to a page that lists all the versions of SQL Server Data Tools you've currently got available. Bear in mind this list might be slightly different when you come to look at the page, so here for me the last update for the page was November 17, 2016, so it may well be different depending on which date you come to look at this page. So the two versions that I have available to download are 16.5 and 17.0 RC1. RC stands for Release Candidate, so it's essentially like a test version. It's not quite fully finished yet. There might be a few bugs still to iron out. I suppose you could say the same about most Microsoft software, to be fair, but anyway, that's besides the point. So the release candidates are the ones that aren't recommended for production use. They may have some new features that haven't been fully tested yet. So the best policy is to go with the one that is recommended for production use. So in this case, for me, it's SQL Server Data Tools 16.5. Now, just before you choose to download SQL Server Data Tools, it's worthwhile mentioning this little message that pops up quite a lot when you try to install these tools. SQL Server Data Tools works best with Visual Studio 2015. Microsoft tried to encourage you to install the full version of Visual Studio before you install SQL Server Data Tools. So you see there's a link here to download Visual Studio Community 2015. It's a completely free edition, you don't have to pay for it. All you have to do is sign up for a Microsoft account just to be able to register the software once you've installed it. You don't have to install Visual Studio at all. If you don't do that, then what will happen is you'll get something called an isolated shell, or an integrated shell version of Visual Studio. So it's the sort of bare minimum components required just to run your SQL Server Data Tools, your business intelligence templates. If you do choose to install Visual Studio Community 2015, the full version, then you get a whole range of other tools available as well. So just going back to Visual Studio and showing you the list of new projects I could choose to create. If you choose to install only SQL Server Data Tools, then you're basically limited to just these business intelligence templates. And if that's all you want, then that's absolutely fine. You don't need to install anything else whatsoever. In fact, there may be an advantage of doing that. Just installing SQL Server Data Tools requires far less disk space than installing the full version of Visual Studio. However, if you do choose to install Visual Studio, you'll get all sorts of other templates for creating pretty much any kind of project you can conceive of. So for instance, there's a category here for Visual C#, which is a programming language, and you can create your own Windows Forms applications, or your own websites, or your own Android mobile apps if you like. There's a whole bunch of templates available here, completely free, that allow you to install Android apps and Android games and things like that. You might even want to go the whole hog and install something called Unity, which allows you to develop your own video games on your machine. There's a whole bunch of templates for developing iOS apps. So basically, if you install the full version of Visual Studio, you'll get a whole lot more choices in terms of creating projects. So that's going to be entirely up to you what you choose to do. If you have decided to install the full version of Visual Studio, it makes sense to do that part first and then come back later on and install SQL Server Data Tools within it. And as I've already installed Visual Studio on the machine I'm going to be teaching you all these other tutorials with, it kind of makes sense for you guys to be using exactly the same setup as me. Now again, this is completely optional, you don't have to do this, but I'm just going to very quickly show you how to install Visual Studio Community 2015. So I want to keep this page open, so I'm going to right click on the link for downloading Visual Studio and choose to open that in a new tab. And that should take me away to a new page, new tab, that allows me to download Community 2015. So if I click that button, it's going to download a little installer file, take me away to a separate page, and in Google Chrome that's indicated to me by this little link in the bottom left hand corner here, where I've got this tiny little installer file downloaded. Now to launch that installer file I can just click on the link here, or I can click on the little up arrow here to choose to show it in its folder and launch it from the downloads folder. One thing I must make sure I've done though is make sure I've closed down Visual Studio already. This part doesn't really make sense for me to do on my own machine because I've already installed Visual Studio, of course. This is just purely to show you the process so you can get it downloaded on your own machine. So I'm just going to close down Visual Studio first of all, and then I'm going to double click the little installer file to launch the install process. So at that point you ought to end up eventually with a little installer application loading up, and depending on what you've already done this could take a little while just to configure and initialize itself, but when the little progress bar is finished you'll get a few options for what it is exactly you want to install. Now once the installer's finished configuring itself, you'll end up with a little screen looking like this, asking you exactly what it is you'd like to install for Visual Studio. You'll get a little hint here about how much disk space that's going to take up. Now this is a bit misleading for me because I've already got it installed. The 371 megabytes here is just for the additional components that I guess I haven't got installed yet. I think initially a base installation, a default installation, takes something in the region of 8 gigabytes, so it's quite a hefty application, which is maybe one good reason for not installing the full version of Visual Studio if you're a little bit limited on disk space. Anyway, the simplest thing to do by far is just choose the default installation, and that's what I'm going to go for here. Alternatively, if you want to configure exactly what it is that gets installed, you can hit the custom option and then hit the next button down at the bottom, and you get then to choose exactly which components you would like to install. Now the reason I've brought you here is because there's a little item here called Microsoft SQL Server Data Tools, which, somewhat confusingly and misleadingly, isn't exactly the same as the data tools we're going to be installing later on. This data tools component here is for a completely different set of templates for working in SQL Server 2012. It's not to do with the business intelligence templates that we're going to install later on. So if you are using the custom install and you see this little item here, it's not the same thing. You still need to install SQL Server Data Tools for the business intelligence templates separately later. So I'm just going to click back, and then I would recommend, unless you desperately want to control exactly what gets installed, I'd recommend just going with the default installation. You can modify everything about your Visual Studio components later on. You can add components you didn't originally choose, and you can remove other components as well, so you can change all that later. So if you've chosen the default, all you would then need to do is click the install button, and I'm not going to do it on my machine of course because, as I say, I've already got Visual Studio installed. I don't need to do it again. But if you click install, that will start installing the application, and it's going to take a little while, so you may want to wait for that to finish and then come back to watch the rest of the video later on. Okay, so once that process is finished, assuming that everything went absolutely perfectly, you ought to end up with this screen giving you a big tempting looking launch button to start Visual Studio. But we don't need to do that just yet. We need to install SQL Server Data Tools first. So I'm just going to click on the cross at the top right hand corner of that little dialog box just to close that one down, and just to tidy up a little bit as well, I'm going to get rid of this downloads window, and then I'm going to also get rid of whichever window is just fired up, probably some kind of survey to fill in. Okay, so welcome to Visual Studio. You can have a quick look on some of the resources on that page. I'm going to close that one down and close down the one that I used to download Visual Studio in the first place. Just head back to my Download SQL Server Data Tools page. Downloading SQL Server Data Tools is pretty straightforward. You can just click on the link that we found earlier on, and once again we ought to end up with a new page giving you the link to actually download the tools, so you can just click Download SQL Server Data Tools. Once again you've got this little recommendation about installing Visual Studio 2015 before doing that, which we now have just done. Let's click Download SQL Server Data Tools however, And once again, I'll get a little installer file being downloaded in and saved in my downloads folder. So again, I can either just click on this link to start the install or show it in its folder just to see what file's been installed. So I can then just double click on that file, and I'll get a new little dialog box asking me to install SQL Server Data Tools. Now, because I've already installed these tools on my machine, I'm going to be seeing a slightly different dialog box to the one that you'll see if you haven't already installed it. You'll be looking at something, I believe, a little bit more like this, where you've got the options to choose exactly which components you install. So you can choose to install templates just for analysis services or reporting services or integration services. I've just installed everything for my particular machine, so it's entirely up to you here what it is you want to do. Whenever you've checked and selected the options that you want, you can just click the install button, or for me it's an updates button down here of course, but when you click the install button, again it's going to go through the process of installing SQL Server Data Tools. Okay, so assuming that everything went correctly, then you should have this setup successful dialog box popping up, and you can just hit the close button to close that one down. And just to do a little bit of tidying up, if you don't want to keep the setup files, you certainly won't need these anymore, you can just select them and then just delete them. Okay, so the last remaining job, I guess, at this point is to check that all the things installed properly and that we can actually start creating business intelligence projects. To create a business intelligence project, you'll need to open up Visual Studio first of all, and you can do that in a variety of different ways. You could have a quick check in the Start menu to see where your new Visual Studio shortcuts have been added. So they'll be added in under Visual Studio 2015, so there's mine, Visual Studio 2015. If you can't be bothered scrolling through the entire list of Start menu shortcuts, you could of course just search for it, so you can have a quick search for Visual Studio, and depending on how many versions you've got installed on your machine, you should find Visual Studio 2015 sitting fairly close to the top of the list. Anyway, when you've found the shortcut, just give it a quick click first of all, and then it'll start launching the application. Now if this is the first time you've done this, you've just installed Visual Studio, this can take quite a while for it to perform all the setup routines. You may see some little extra messages like this one popping up while it does all of its setup tasks, and then it finally starts. Another thing you'll probably encounter when you first install Visual Studio is you'll encounter a message that asks you to log in to a Microsoft account. Now it's a completely optional step. You'll find there's a link on the dialog box that says not at this time, so you can just choose to not sign in to begin with. But at some point you will want to do that, and the reason you'll want to do that at some point is because the default license, if you've installed Visual Studio Community 2015, the default license is only for 30 days. So if you wanted to check or make sure that license becomes valid, so it's activated for the lifetime of the product, then you want to sign in at some point, and you can do that just fairly easily by clicking the sign in link up at the top right hand corner. So should you want to do that, you can click the sign in link and you'll get a little dialog box like this one asking you to sign in. So you can sign in with an email address. I think it needs to be a Microsoft account, so you can just sign up for a free Hotmail account if you don't have a Microsoft account already, but it's definitely worthwhile doing that to make sure that you activate the license. Anyway, I've done this already for this particular machine, so I don't need to do that at this point. I'm just going to close down that dialog box and then have a quick look at how to create a new business intelligence project. The easiest way to create the new project is just to click the new project link in the start list on the left hand side of the start page. If you've either accidentally closed that one down or it hasn't appeared, the other way you can do this is head to the file menu and choose new and then choose project. When you do that, what should happen is you get a big dialog box full of all the possible project templates. Now again, if that's the first time you've done that, it may take a little while for Visual Studio to populate this dialog box. Just be slightly patient, you will get to this stage eventually. And depending on what you've actually installed, of course, this will sort of determine the list of templates you've got available. But hopefully, if you've installed SQL Server Data Tools, you've got this lovely business intelligence category which you can select and have a quick look into. Now if you choose business intelligence by itself, you'll get a list of the common templates. You can drill into each of the individual categories there and see a few more specific templates. So for instance, for analysis services, there's an extra template there for importing from Power Pivot in Excel. Anyway, just to check that you can create a project, and of course we'll be doing this in a lot more detail in the individual video tutorials on these various different products, but I'm just going to quickly select a report server project. I'm going to change the location. I'm going to store this on my desktop for the time being, so I'm going to hit the browse button and then point this to my desktop. click Select Folder, and then just click OK just to make sure that the business intelligence templates actually will work. Now again, if this is the first time, it's probably going to take a little bit longer than normal. But eventually what you should end up with is a new project opened up with a little message at the bottom saying that the project was created successfully. Just to check on that, I can quickly click into the Solution Explorer window here over there on the right hand side, have a very quick look to see that I've got a report project called Report Project 1 with all the various default folders available. Now just while I'm here, it's probably worthwhile quickly mentioning a few of the basic techniques you can use to work in Visual Studio, just in case you've never done that before. So you'll notice that there's lots and lots of different windows open, and the exact windows you'll see will depend on which type of project you've chosen. So if I chose to create an integration services project, I'd have a few different windows available at this point as well. There are some common windows, so for instance the Solution Explorer should always appear. That gives you a list of all the objects that belong to the project you've created. You should also see the Properties window available somewhere towards the bottom right corner of the screen as well, giving you properties of whatever object you've selected. Now it's possible to rearrange windows and close them down and open them and so on, so just to give you a very quick overview, if I wanted to close down the properties window, I can do that just by clicking the cross in the top right hand corner of that window and it will disappear completely. Should I want to bring it back, then the View menu is the place to go to bring back any windows that you've closed down. So I go to the View menu, scroll to the bottom there's the Properties window. There's also a keyboard shortcut to display that window. I can select that by clicking there or pressing the F4 key, and the Properties window should reappear. You'll also notice there may be some windows sort of tucked away in little tabs at the left hand side or the right hand side of the screen. So for instance I've got here a toolbox tool. If I click on the toolbox window, that'll pop out to show me all the items available in the toolbox. I'll get a little message explaining that it's going to try to populate the available objects in the toolbox, which again can take quite a while if that's the first time you've launched the toolbox. Now if I click away from or into a different window, the toolbox will snap back to its little tab on the left hand side. Should I want to make it sit there permanently, I can click on the toolbox tab to expose the window and then click on the little drawing pin icon, the auto hide button there, that'll pin it in place so it sits there now and won't tab away to the left hand side of the screen when I click into a different window. Should I want to make it a tabbed document again so it hides itself, I can just click on the same little drawing pin icon and it'll snap back to a little tab at the left hand side. You can also change the positions of all these windows as well. So let's say you don't want windows sitting on the left hand side of the screen at all. I can click on the toolbox and then click and drag to detach it from the left hand side of the screen. If I just release the mouse button at any point, it now sits as like a free floating window. But I can also drag it to other positions on the screen. You'll see these little icons pop up, and if I drag over these little icons, you'll see it occupies a different area of the screen, so it'll snap to and sit in different places on the screen. So for instance, I could make the toolbox sit alongside the Properties window at the bottom here. If I just drag it over the Properties window and drag it into the middle of that set of icons there in the middle of the Properties window. So now I've got the toolbox and the Properties window sitting in the same place. Of course, it's very easy to get this messed up. You can easily get into a bit of a mess with all your windows. So if I get to the point where I've dragged all my windows around me, I've closed down some things I didn't mean to close down, and I've got windows sitting where they shouldn't be and occupying all sorts of weird parts of the screen, trying to get everything back into its original position can be a bit of a pain. So fortunately there's a quick simple way you can achieve that. There's a window menu at the top of the screen, and in there should be a reset all windows layout or reset window layout option. So there it is, reset window layout. If I click on that link and then just click yes, I definitely want to do that, everything should just snap back to its original default position. Now there are lots and lots of different settings you can modify about Visual Studio as well, so everything from basic sort of colour schemes through to really detailed intricate settings about exactly how the application works. So should you want to modify any of those, you can head to the Tools menu and choose Options from right down the bottom of the list. Now there are many options you can change in here, so there's all sorts of different tabs, little nodes on the left hand side in all sorts of different categories for exactly how you would like to get things displayed. So for instance, just really something quite simple, I could change the color scheme using the basic general settings here. I can change the color scheme of my Visual Studio application. Let's go for light and then click OK, and that'll change the overall appearance of all the elements of the application. It takes a surprisingly long time for that to happen, just to change the basic color scheme, but it will eventually end up with, there's my light theme. So if you prefer that compared to the darker blue scheme, then you can have a go at that. We'll be changing a bunch of these settings as we go along through the various other tutorials. tutorial, so I'm not going to go into a load of detail right now about how to modify things. We can change things as we go along. But once again, if you get into a bit of a mess with your settings and you would just want to get everything reset back to the original default factory settings, you can head back to the Tools menu and then choose Import and Export Settings. So if you choose Import and Export Settings, you could choose to reset everything, reset all settings, and click Next. You can choose if you want to save your current settings, so you can go back to a previous configuration. I'm just going to click No, just reset everything, overwriting my existing settings. I can click Next, and then you get a bunch of different defaults. The default, if that makes sense, is the General settings. So I'm going to choose General, then click Finish, and then everything will go back to what it was before, and I can click Close. Now you may notice that that doesn't include colour schemes. That's not part of the overall settings, so I've got still my light scheme. So I go back to the Tools menu and choose Options, and then I can change the colour scheme back to the blue colour that I had originally. Click OK, and hopefully that won't take too long to get it back to blue, and there we go. Okay, just one quick final thing to mention before we finish this video, just to show you how you can close and then reopen projects you've previously worked on, although of course we'll be doing that a lot in the next set of video tutorials. So, simplest way to close down the entire project or solution is just to close down the entire application, which you can do from the cross in the top right hand corner, or you can head to the File menu and choose to just close the current solution. So if I just head to the File menu and choose Close Solution, that will keep Visual Studio open but close down any files and projects that I was working on. Now, if I've got Visual Studio open already and I wanted to reopen a project, the simplest thing to do is head to the File menu and then choose Recent Projects and Solutions and choose the one that I've just been working on there. I can also choose to open a project or solution, so if there's one that I haven't worked on for a while, I can choose to open that one by clicking that link there. I stored my project on my desktop, so in this case I can browse back to my desktop. There's my report project 1, which I can double click into. Then I can open this file with the SLN, the solution extension. If I double click on that, that will open up the entire project and set of projects in my solution with all the files associated with them. Of course, I could have just closed down the entirety of Visual Studio there, which I can do quite happily, and then open up Visual Studio again. In fact, what I'm going to do this time, if I scroll down in the list to find my Visual Studio shortcut, I'm going to pin it to my Start menu like I have with a lot of other of my my oft-used applications. So I'm going to right-click Visual Studio 2015 and choose Pin to Start, and that will stick a new icon on the main part of the Start menu. Then I can right-click on that icon and choose Resize and make it small. I can drag it into a different group, so I could move it into a group. So I've already got a couple of versions of Visual Studio installed, so I can drag it up to my Visual Studio group up here. If you want to edit the title of that group in Windows 10, you can just click into there and then just edit the title and hit enter. When I want to open the application, I can just click on the icon and that will open up Visual Studio again, hopefully into the Start page, which we saw earlier on. Shouldn't take quite as long to open this time after you've opened it once. So if you want to get back to a recent project, there should be a recently used projects list on the Start page, which I can just click on, and that of course will open up the same project again. Okay, so at this point I'm just going to close down Visual Studio and I'm going to close down the web browser I had open earlier on. If you want to remove the project, so again we're going to be creating lots of projects throughout the rest of the video tutorials that we're going to create, you can just happily delete that folder from wherever you first created it, so I can just pop that straight into the recycle bin. Okay, so that basically wraps up this simple video on getting up and running with SQL Server Data Tools. As I say, this is basically just a way to get you set up and ready for all the other fantastic tutorial series we're going to be creating on all the business intelligence type projects. Hope you find that one useful. Thanks for watching. See you next time. If you like what you've seen here, why not head over to the WiseR website, where you can find loads more free resources, including these videos, some written blogs and tutorials, and even some exercises that you can download to practice your skills. Thanks for watching, see you next time.